Welcome to Speak Your Mind by Mobilize. My guest for this session is Guido Palazzo. Guido is a business ethics professor at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. If you're not following Guido on LinkedIn, you're missing out. His posts are thought-provoking and well-researched and insightful, and he forces you to think about things that normally don't cross your screen. Hi, Guido. Thanks for being with us. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Brett. Thanks for having me.
In this session, Guido is going to be speaking about whether 2050 net zero is a reasonable goal considering the state of Earth's ecosystems. So, Guido, the floor is yours.
Well, I guess the reason why you created this wonderful initiative and the reason why both of us engage in this topic is that obviously 2050 is not sufficient. Obviously, because the science tells us to be much faster than that, and yet nothing happens, or not enough happens. We keep emitting more CO2 every year. We're wiping out more species every year. And the question is why? If we know better, why don't we change behavior? Well, the first thing we have to understand is that there are actors who, surprisingly or not surprisingly, have no interest in change. They have vested interests in keeping things as they are. So the ecological crisis is less a threat to them than managing the crisis, because it will threaten their profits, it might threaten their existence, it might threaten the well-being of entire countries if we move forward too fast. So it's a clash of interest in a way. However, they can no longer flat out deny. This is no longer possible. Well, some people do, but it's increasingly ridiculous to deny the science. If you just look into the analysis of scientists, I mean, there are 10,000 of papers written by scientists in various domains, and meta-studies of those 10,000 of papers show that there is a consensus of more than 99% that climate change is man-made and requires urgent action. So this is a consensus that is pretty much close to the consensus on gravity. Therefore, to flat out deny is difficult. And denialism has therefore been replaced in many places now by delayism. So if the change is unavoidable and you can no longer claim it is not, at least try to make that change as slow as possible so that you can continue reaping the benefits of the fossil fuel extraction and consumption as long as possible. So what we currently observe in the debate is, in the public debate, is a narrative struggle. It's a narrative struggle in which two different stories clash. One story is the story of urgent change. It's the story of science. It's the story of the climate change activist. And on the other side, you have this story that tells us we have plenty of time to master the crisis. And this second story is obviously one that is at the core of the interest of the fossil fuel industry and friends. And I would like to share the key elements of that story with you so that when you see it in the news, you recognize it. The first element of that kind of story, of the delayism story, is we do not need radical change. We need, instead of that, a reasonable reform process. And that reform process will not challenge the fundamental institutional order of things. So it's a kind of slow transition into something that looks pretty much as the world today. And those who ask for faster change, activists who group themselves on the street, scientists who protest, or green politicians, they're labeled as hysteric, as elitist, even as terrorist. And it is argued that their claims are unrealistic and that they're even dangerous for society. So this narrative or this story tells us we don't need behavioral change. What we need is technological innovation. So science will save us. There will be innovations coming that will abracadabra like magic, solve our problems with the ecology. And for companies, that means they just can peacefully continue their business as usual. What they only should do is they might use green energy, or they might compensate for the harm they do by buying CO2 rights, or by sucking it out of the air, by planting trees. But there is no need for deeper reflections on how we design our supply chains. There's no need for deeper reflections on how we consume, how we live. Just take the example of mobility. It seems that there is a consensus emerging now that the only change we need is we switch from diesel cars to electric cars, and that's it. So we can keep the individualistic mobility going. And the main responsibility for all the trouble we are in lays with the individual. You and I should change our behavior. That's the message. And they invent even tools for that. BP has invented the ecological footprint calculator. And if you go to one of those applications or websites and you add one flight, and you see your whole CO2 emissions explode, and you feel guilty. And you know there's not much you can do because you have to take that flight. You have to consume that kind of energy because that's how you live. So you feel guilty. You understand I can do nothing about it. So how can I then claim that others should change? Oil companies, because I see already how I myself am struggling so much. So it lames me in a way because the shift of guilt keeps me from asking critical questions to bigger and more powerful actors. But the most dangerous element, in my view, in this story of delayism is this promotion of fear. So this play with people's loss aversion. So this assumption that in the end it's the citizens who already struggle with their little incomes who will pay the price for this big change, and they feel uncertain and anxious about that. They don't want even more trouble in their life, and that's why this label of activist as elite works so well. And these are the elite. They don't understand problems of small people, and I struggle with my life, so I don't want that. I want to keep going. It's already difficult enough. So this play with fear is also reinforced by another point, by this argument, well, your right to consume, that's your freedom. We saw this also during COVID. Why should I limit my freedom of consumption? That's freedom, that's human rights. And if that is my human right, what scientists, activists, green politicians are trying to do is they take away my freedom. And I don't want that. Now, if you combine this with some kind of long-term lofty objectives like 2050, and you provide tons of data in which you drown people about how close you get to that slowly over time, you make it easier to rationalize. You make it easier to say, yeah, it's difficult, it's a journey. I hate this word journey, by the way, because it helps to do nothing, or to say we delay things. So it helps you to feel well while doing nothing. It helps you to feel well while not criticizing fossil fuel companies or governments. So that is the story, and that is a dangerous story, because we know from science that we have to radically transform how we produce and how we consume, how we live. We have to get rid of mass consumption. A colleague of mine, Sasha Nick, and his colleague, Philippe Thalmann from the EPFL, so the Technical University here in Lausanne, they have calculated that in order to get to net zero in 2050 for flying alone, aviation has to be cut by 85%. So we can only fly 15% of what we fly today. That sounds drastic, but if you think back, that's more or less the number of flights we had before globalization in the 1980s. Julia Steinberger from my university and colleagues, they have calculated that if we want to achieve our climate goals, we have to reduce drastically the space we heat or cool per person. So probably not more than 14 square meters can be heated or cooled, which will come with a very different way of building houses, building private and public space in houses, and just limiting what is available to each of us. We also know we have to stop consuming plastic and throw it away. We have to reduce meat consumption drastically, and we probably have to stop fast fashion. So overall, the message that we get if we go into the science is consume less, produce less, and the things you keep consuming and producing, do that in a way that you recycle and regenerate and do it with the regenerative process. So that's what I mean. It's a clash of these two stories. One tells us change fast and change everything, and the other one tells us no need to change. We have time. Don't be hysteric. Science will solve us our problems sooner or later. You don't have to do nothing. The reason why this kind of story is so much more appealing is that people hate change. People hate uncertainty. People hate leaving their comfort zone. And with this story, it's so easy to rationalize doing nothing because we all feel this cognitive dissonance. And we see the world burning, we see the droughts, we see these things, species disappearing. But with that kind of delayism story, we can see it and still do nothing and feel well because we can rationalize the urgency away. The Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, he once argued that those in society who hold the power are not the ones who own the property means of production, like Marx would say. It's not the ones who govern us, like liberal theory would say. It's the one who control the story. It's the one who have an impact on the worldview of people, on what we take for granted. And that is why the fight between the stories, this battle of narratives, is so crucial. We do not just have an ecological crisis, we have a crisis of narratives. And what we need is we have to move our story, the story of urgent change, center stage from the margins. It is now pushed to the margins by the media who are on the side of the fossil fuel industry, who very often are the same as the owners of the media. So our challenge is, how do we craft a vision, a narrative that is so attractive that people are willing to change? How do we get a vision of a better and more sustainable future in which, yes, we have to change, but these changes come with a benefit? We will be more happy, probably, in that new world, because we are not that happy in this world. Depression explodes. How can we neutralize the influence of the delayism story? Well, by a new, better, and more convincing story that we have on our side. So it's not scientific knowledge that brings the change. Scientists have believed that for so long, and it's wrong. People don't behave the way they behave because of scientific facts. They behave in the way they behave because of the worldview in which they're embedded, the things they believe, the causal claims, the values, the ideas about what keeps us together as society. So let me maybe finish by giving you three elements of what I believe are key for this new narrative, because we all have to narrate this together. It's not one person who can narrate that. The first thing we have to include in that story is a redefinition of our relationship with the world. What if we would understand a forest or a dolphin as a stakeholder? What if we would consider non-human actors as agents with their own rights that have to be protected, with their own representation in stakeholder dialogues, for instance? The second point, we need a new understanding of human nature. What if our default would not be competition, as we are told since 200 years, but cooperation? What if we would teach cooperation instead of competition, for instance, at business schools? In my school, as in probably most of the business schools around the world, we have plenty of classes on competition. Everyone teaches Michael Porter's 5 forces, which basically tells you everyone is your enemy. Clients are enemies, governments are enemies, suppliers are enemies. They want something from you. Protect yourself against them. What if we would, instead of that, teach cooperation? Third element, what if we would move from understanding the world by analyzing it, drilling into details, and instead would understand the world as a holistic system? We look at the connections, not at the elements, not the knots in the system. What if you would not look at the tree, but the forest, and understand how things connect and how fragile these connections are and how we are embedded in that system that we might call Gaia? But all that requires a new enlightenment, and that new enlightenment is supposed, I hope, to produce that new narrative. Thanks, Brad. Back to you.
Guido, fascinating as always. I appreciate your perspective. It's they've got us twisted in knots, don't they? They're telling us, "Don't worry, you got nothing to do." They've got the most seasoned PR professionals and marketing professionals telling us that we're the fault of this whole problem. They control the media, telling us what the narrative is supposed to be. It's a huge challenge, but it is a challenge of the narrative, exactly like you said. Um, so you said a lot of great things, and I'm just wondering, is there one takeaway or one message that you would like to leave the audience with before you go?
Well, as you said, it's interesting to see how this all unfolds, and it's not new. We have seen this happening with the tobacco industry already. What we see right now happening in the climate change debate is an application of the playbook of what tobacco did for decades, telling us there's no need to change, there's no need to control, it's all harmless, and we wait for the science to be clear. So what I would give to everyone as a message is, do not underestimate the soft power of storytelling. It's not the science that will bring the change. We have plenty of science. It's enough. We know it now. It's the story that makes the difference, that makes or breaks this ecological transition.
Absolutely. And we have a lot of great storytellers who we're going to bring up in future sessions. Thanks so much, Guido, for sharing your ideas. I'm inspired by people like you, um, and I look forward to facing these challenges together as we start a new year. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Brad.